They say there are going to be two speakers during this segment. I've been asked to remind the speakers to please use the microphone and not to drift away from the microphone. If you can speak up, since you don't have microphones up, if you can speak up with your questions, that would also be helpful. If we need to repeat the question before we ask the speakers to respond. They say we have two speakers today. Our first speaker takes us to a place where we examine what is the question. And he tells us that the question is inseparable from time, place, and person of the questioner. David Bade studied linguistics at the University of Illinois in the 1970s, returning to the same university to attend library school after several years working in various libraries around the country. A long-term objective of his is to bring into LIS perspectives other disciplines and particularly voices from outside the Anglo-American world. Mr. Bade tells us that he has many questions and very few answers, and he thinks that's the way it should be. Please help me welcome David Bade.
Can I put this here somewhere, or am I going to mess it up? I forgot to bring my reading glasses, so I'm going to be in the same position as I am at work. It's also David Bade, just to make that clear. I'm short too. Okay, I wrote too much, so I have to read really fast, so I hope you can listen really fast. I'm going to start with the mathematical theory of communication, and the second section will be remarks on rhetorical theory, particularly that of Michel Meyer, the Belgian philosopher, and finish with remarks on ethics and how the rhetorical theory illuminates some of those ethical aspects in information science. Claude Shannon began the second paragraph of his 1948 paper, The Mathematical Theory of Communication, with the following remarks. The fundamental problem of communication is that of reproducing at one point either exactly or approximately a message selected at another point. Frequently the messages have meaning, that is, they refer to or are correlated according to some system with certain physical or conceptual entities. These semantic aspects of communication are irrelevant to the engineering problem. The significant aspect is that the actual message is one selected from a set of possible messages. The system must be designed to operate for each possible selection, not just the one which will actually be chosen, since this is unknown at the time of design." End quote. This remarkable passage acknowledges four of Shannon's assumptions about communication, each of which are significant from a rhetorical and linguistic perspective. First, the fundamental problem of communication is assumed to be one of reproducing a given message. Neither the message itself nor its production and comprehension are a part of the problem of communication, only its reproduction. What a message is in this theory remains unstable. Rather than providing a definition or even a discussion of what a message is, Shannon gives an ad hoc list of types of messages, a sequence of letters, a single function of time, etc. We learn that a message can be transmitted and that it has an intended destination. Weaver informs us that an information source selects a desired message, which may consist of written or spoken words or pictures, music, etc. But what a message is and how it is to be understood theoretically, we are not told, though we should not miss the element of desire that slipped in his statement. The second assumption is that a message may or may not mean anything. Weaver in his comments states that among the possible messages from which an information source chooses two messages, one of which is heavily loaded with meaning and the other which is pure nonsense, can be exactly equivalent from the present viewpoint. Shannon's third assumption is that the meaning of a message is irrelevant to the engineering problem. Note that the meaning of the message is considered to be one of the semantic aspects of communication, but not of the engineering problem. Has Shannon simply abandoned a theory of communication in favor of the engineering problem of the transmission of signals? This seems both unlikely in view of the title of the paper and irreconcilable with his preceding remarks on the fundamental problem, the reproduction of a message, and the possibility of meaningless messages. It appears that Shannon is simply assuming that communication is indeed an engineering feat, and the communicative activity that is also meaningful activity is only one type of communication, a corollary of this second assumption. Given that assumption, the semantic aspects of any particular communicative act are merely empirical facts of particular messages and therefore of no theoretical import. As Janich described it, meaningful or meaningless, true or false, useful or useless, understandable or incomprehensible play no role in the functioning of communication technologies. The fourth assumption is that a message, whatever that is not something created to fit a communication situation, but one among a number of possible messages available for selection and transmission. What is a possible message or a set of possible messages? Clearly, this is not a question that can be answered if the notion of message itself remains unstated and undefined. What is clear is that this stock of possible messages pre-exists the communication situation, since the actual message is one selected from a set of possible messages. Janich criticized this position, remarking, "The concept of a stock of possible messages has nothing to do with the openness of human communication, but with the functional limitations of a technical system and the use of tools." Later adding, "The traditional theories of information and communication never ask why. Information and communication are always already there as natural facts at that." Finally, given these assumptions, Shannon recognizes that the engineering problem is to design for probabilities rather than realities. As Weaver puts it, information in Shannon's theory has nothing to do with meaning. It treats the statistical character of a whole ensemble of messages rather than with particular messages, and, quote, "In these statistical terms, the two words information and uncertainty find themselves to be partners. This, if nothing else, should give us pause." Weaver asks whether or not Shannon's theory is merely a theory of the technical problem, and answers this question with the statement that the theory is, at least to a significant degree, also a theory of the semantic problem and the effectiveness problem. Weaver associates these three problems of a theory of communication with three questions. The technical problem, how accurately can the symbols of communication be transmitted? The semantic problem, how precisely do the transmitted symbols convey the desired meaning? And the effectiveness problem, how effectively does the received meaning affect conduct in the desired way? These three problems and the questions reflect three of the basic elements of Shannon's diagram of a communication system: the transmitter, the message, and the receiver. A look at Shannon's diagram, however, reveals 5 parts through which the message moves, first as message, then transformed as signal, and finally as reproduction of original message. Those parts are an information source, a transmitter, a channel, a receiver, and destination. The diagram itself suggests the tripart division of Weaver's three problems, and indeed the subsequent discourse on the Shannon model has largely tended to discuss it as a model of sender, message, and receiver. Just what are the terminal points in the Shannon model, and what is their significance? Both Shannon's conception of the activity of the information source as being selection of a possible message, and Weaver's identification of the technical problem as being the transmission of symbols, betray the theoretical nullity of both the information source and the destination. The information source is simply the terminus of the system at one end, with the destination being the terminus at the other end. Neither play any role in the operation or theoretical understanding of Shannon's communication system. The receiver's answer plays no role in this view, Janich observed, and indeed what we find in Shannon and Weaver is simply a message presented to the transmitter within a technical system which converts it to a set of signals or symbols, a significant equivocation, to be reconverted by the receiver, also still within the technical system, and deposited at the opposite terminus. Why, whence, from, and to whom the message was selected and transmitted are all irrelevant questions for the operation of such a system of communication. Weaver claims that when I talk to you, my brain is the information source, my vocal system is the transmitter, and your ear and the associated eighth nerve is the receiver. Weaver actually serves to muddle the picture with this remark, since the information source is identified not with the speaking eye, but with the brain of the speaking eye, and the destination of the message is not you with whom I am talking, but rather your brain. As Roy Harris pointed out, this is a mere logical fallacy, one which involves attributing to parts of a human being or animal features and functions that logically belong only to the whole creature. Dupuy criticized the concept of information as found in Shannon and Weaver's work on the grounds that it is only when you ignore all matters related to the creation of information and its meaning that you can treat it as a thing in a technical system. But this, transmitting a signal through a technical system for no other reason than to adequately reproduce it at the other end, was precisely Shannon's task as an engineer. There could be no information technologies as we know them if the designers of the system had to deal with actual messages, their creation, and their meanings at both ends of the system. The rhetorical theory of communication treats all of those. Ancient rhetoric was based on 3 primary assumptions. There is a speaker, who has something to say to someone. Thus, rhetorical theory from Aristotle to the 20th century has distinguished three concepts of argumentation. The first concerning the facts, or logos, the second the interpretation of the facts, pathos, and the third the legitimacy of the speaker, ethos. Myers suggested that these three concepts can all be unified by recognizing the interrogativity that underlies them. He noted that by viewing argumentation and all rhetoric from the perspective of interrogativity, a clear distinction between two uses of rhetoric becomes clear. A rhetoric focused on the question, or white rhetoric, and a rhetoric focused on an answer, or what Roland Barthes called black rhetoric. The former is a rhetoric that brings to light and clarifies facts and interpretations in the manner and motives, logic, or passion for the arguments given, while the latter manipulates, striving to present as conclusive, true, and just what in reality is the very matter in question. In fact, Meyer argues, to consider a matter interrogatively, or on the other hand not to care about the question, is all that separates white from black rhetoric, critical usage from manipulation or closure. In rhetorical terms, communication theories based on the Shannon and Weaver model deal with logos, messages, exclusively, regarding all matters pertaining to ethos, the authors or creators and the creation of information, as well as pathos, the receiver, as stochastic processes rather than ethical agents. Understanding communication as logos alone provides no grounds from which to make any ethical inquiry, since ethical issues require ethical subjects, responsible agents as participants in communicative action. Rhetorical theory in ancient Greece and Rome was concerned with public speaking and more broadly with the art of effective communication, emphasizing the speaker's qualifications, knowledge, and skill, that is, ethos. Aristotle defined rhetoric as the faculty of observing in any given case available means of persuasion, and followed this definition with the discussion of how rhetoric differs from other arts. I quote Aristotle here. Every other art can instruct or persuade about its own particular subject matter. For instance, medicine about what is healthy and unhealthy, geometry about the properties of magnitudes, arithmetic about numbers, and the same is true of the other arts and sciences. But rhetoric we look upon as the power of observing the means of persuasion on almost any subject presented to us, and that is why we say that in its technical character it is not concerned with any special or definite case or subject. End quote. This is a particularly interesting passage in light of the previous discussion of Shannon and Weaver. Like the mathematical theory of communication, Aristotle understood rhetoric in its technical character as having no concern with the particulars of any communicative activity. Yet unlike Shannon and Weaver, Aristotle does not ignore the information source, nor does he give short shrift to the audience or destination, for he follows the definition quoted above with remarks on the three modes of persuasion, or proofs, which convince the hearer. Of the modes of persuasion furnished by the spoken word, there are three kinds. The first kind depends on the personal character, ethos, of the speaker. The second, on putting the audience into a certain frame of mind, pathos. The third, on the proof or apparent proof provided by the words of the speech itself, logos. Ancient rhetorics emphasized ethos, and that emphasis is fairly clear in the passage just quoted. Both pathos and logos are conceived as elements of communication strictly from the point of view of the speaker. In Meyer's rhetoric, ethos, logos, and pathos are all of equal importance, and in this respect, as in many others, his rhetoric provides a basis for a far-reaching critique, not only of earlier rhetorics, but of information science. Meyer offers a new definition of rhetoric. That is, rhetoric is the negotiation of distances between human beings in regard to a question, a problem. He derives his definition from a statement by Aristotle. The use of persuasive speech is directed to a judgment. There is no further need of speech on subjects that we know and have already judged. We cannot, Meyer insists, allow rhetoric to be limited to the art of persuasion without losing sight of communication's other dimensions. Of particular importance is Meyer's insistence that rhetoric is not a technique for manipulating others, but a negotiation, a general social practice arising from the perception of a problem. The problems and questions that arise in life situations lead us to engage others. Although persuasion is one type of communicative activity, human communication is not limited to that kind of interaction alone. In fact, Meyer writes, rhetoric is the encounter of men and of language through exposing their differences and their identities. They affirm each other in order to recover, to reclaim, to find a moment of communion, or, on the contrary, to evoke the impossibility of communion and to acknowledge the wall that separates them. In Meyer's rhetoric, it is not our knowledge, but our problems and the questions to which they give rise that constitute the starting point of all communication. The consequence of putting questioning first is that all answers are responses to an originary question which remains. Knowledge becomes a contextual matter. The answer given need only solve the problem faced. It can never eliminate the question of what really is, but only how to proceed in our business. With epistemology unseated, ontology with its being and essences vanishes, and the syllogism stops dead in its presuppositions, for what is always what is in question. And I quote Meyer, "The syllogism is a synthesis, which means that it requires that we start from the known to determine the unknown. Just because a conclusion follows naturally from certain premises does not mean that it is known as such. Likewise, knowing the premises which lead to a conclusion does not mean that one necessarily knows the particular conclusion which may result from them." End quote. The syllogism requires that we start from the known, that we agree on the premises from which we are to draw the conclusions. Socrates is a man, all men are mortal. But what one individual knows is only relative and is different from what others know. So every premise is a presupposition that itself can be debated. Socrates is, after all, Stanford's library catalog, just as Melville is Berkeley's, and whether they are mortal or not depends entirely on what you mean by mortal. And for that matter, many have declared that other Socrates immortal. It is this kind of problem, whether we describe it as a problem of homonymy, polysemy, ignorance, or alternatives, that prompts Meyer to go back to the Socratic question, what is X? Quote, "If one demands what is X, this evidently presupposes that X is something, A rather than B, for example, since one must know what it is we are asking about and not confuse it with some other thing. So to say that X is A or that X is B is already to specify what it is that one is asking for." End quote. And here Meyer joins Roy Harris, who provides a complementary analysis of Aristotle's understanding of language and communication. Quote, "Aristotle's account already implies or presupposes a theory of linguistic communication, namely that the hearer understands what the speaker says in virtue of knowing the set of conventions to which the speaker's utterances conform. Only thus can the hearer grasp what it is that the speaker is saying. However, there is an elementary difficulty. How is it that the hearer can relate the sounds the speaker articulates to the same things as the speaker, in his own mind, relates them to? For while the sounds the speaker utters can be heard, what he means by them is not audible." Aristotle wanted, indeed needed, to guarantee understanding among interlocutors and chose language as that guarantee. If language, logos alone, rather than the speaker, is the source of meaning and the guarantee of understanding, then it is not you and I who speak and who must be trusted or not trusted, but as Heidegger famously declared, it is the Sprache that spricht, although of course it is not sprichting so well in this sentence. Of this move away from human responsibility, Harrison Hutton remarked, "Thus the postulate of semantic determinacy makes it possible to transfer the responsibility for making meaning from the individual to the collectivity, and from the circumstantial to the macrosocial level. Words come to be construed as autonomous signs that can and do function semantically without support from any other semiological source, providing the essential self-sustaining mechanisms for the facilitation and regulation not only of human interactions, but of human thought itself." And here again, we are left with no grounds for ethical investigation of any speech act, for it is not we, but the language, our stock of possible messages, that determines what is meant. Meyer makes another distinction between the projective ethos and pathos and the projective ethos and the projective pathos, distinguishing these from the effective ethos and the effective pathos. Since social life is founded upon the distance that must be continually negotiated at each encounter, the speaker must integrate that distance a priori in the form of a relation, even though that may fail. He must construct an image of the other just as the other must construct an image of him. The distance is one of cultural and personal values which lead to different questions, and since we never truly know people, we are obliged to supplement the fragmented reality with which we are confronted. Thus, it is inevitable that there must be a mismatch between the projective ethos, how the speaker is imagined by the interlocutor, and the effective ethos, the speaker as he or she really is, and between the projective pathos and the effective pathos. The projective auditor, the reader as we imagine her to be, may or may not have much to do with the actual auditor, and all that we intend to accomplish by communicating may come to naught. Quote, "In the ethos-pathos-logos relation, the pathos projective leads to a triple response. The understanding of what the speaker wants to say, what is in question is the question to him, the adequacy of the response, and the persuasive interest of the proposition. If I address myself to someone, I make that triple hypothesis. The difference will be eradicated by persuasion, my response will be judged adequate, and the other will necessarily understand my point of view as well as my intentions. But the auditor is not forced to react as I imagine or hope he will. The pathos effectif, that is to say, the real auditor, is moved by other parameters. Now we go on to ethics. How does a rhetorical approach allow us to make ethical critiques of information technology? Time does not permit more than a cursory discussion of 3 items, namely the problem of ethos, the creation and use of metadata, and the idea of a semantic web. The differences between the information source as conceived in the mathematical theory of communication and the ethos of rhetorical theory are multiple. One of the chief differences concerns issues of authority. Does the source of information have any bearing on the particular context of information seeking? The mathematical theory hides this issue under the concept of noise, disturbances arising from a channel other than the one being utilized, while treating all messages from whatever information source as equivalent. The logos or message matters, the ethos or source does not. In contrast, from a rhetorical perspective, ethos or information source is a crucial factor. Meyer argued that the de-emphasis or even denial of the significance of both ethos and pathos is characteristic of 20th century rhetorics, and both Derrida and the history of information science present clear examples. Commenting on Derrida's statement, all writing then, in order to be what it is, must be able to function in the radical absence of any empirically determined accuracy in general, Roy Harris remarked that this means that a text is intrinsically complete. An interpreter is surplus to requirements. The text needs neither the presence nor the author, nor the presence of a reader. Harris associates this with the development of literacy. I quote, "In pre-literate societies, words are part of the vocal activities of speakers, and what words mean is part of what the speaker means on some particular occasion. In literate societies, by contrast, words are abstractions that take priority over both their vocal and their scriptural manifestations, and over both speakers and hearers simultaneously. The speaker loses his privileged role of being in absolute control of what his utterances mean, for the words used can now be referred for arbitration to a source independent of both speaker and hearer. The modern disregard of ethos and pathos is thus a result of the decontextualization of the products of communicative activity and has characterized information science from its origins. In a fascinating book on the internet, Philippe Breton compared the ideas about communication in society held by pioneers of informatics like Turing and Wiener with similar ideas current in the culture of the internet. From the perspective of an understanding of humans as information processing systems, Breton writes, a human being is simply a program among programs. I quote at length. This test that Turing called the imitation game consisted in a device where a questioner addresses 2 separate partners in 2 distinct rooms and asks them all sorts of questions without any direct physical contact with them. If the questioner is not able to tell the difference between the 2, then they are fundamentally similar. The first version of the test was applied to the distinction between a man and a woman, the second between a man and a machine, a human and a machine, and in this case, a computer. Turing was convinced that soon a computer would be indistinguishable from a human being in the game. Behind that test was a more fundamental point of view which was described by Turing's biographer Andrew Hodges. The discrete state machine communicating by teleprinter alone was like an ideal for his own life, in which he would be left alone in a room of his own to deal with the outside world solely by rational argument. That ideal of life shows us that the idea of the network, of the human being made by the network, preceded by far its concrete realization. Let us imagine for just an instant that Turing's ideal of life were fully realized. This means that just as humans talking among themselves would not know whether they were conversing with another human or with a machine, so machines could not know whether they were addressing a human being or one of their own. For Turing, who very well expressed the thinking of the first informaticians as well as that of the current internet fundamentalists, man and woman, human and computer, all belong in essence to the same category, which we have called the informational energon." End quote. The reference to gender in the above passage should not be missed. In an earlier work appropriately titled in English, In the Image of Man, Breton traced the history of humanity's imagination of artificial life in both artistic and literary forms, as well as attempts to physically create imitation humans. His study revealed that with the sole exception of the medieval golem, all these creations served to replace the human female with an obedient slave, fashioned to answer our desires, not to question them like a real woman would. And according to Breton, the most spectacularly successful of all these attempts was the virtual sex slaves created for the world of the internauts. A creature that says only what we permit it to say, means only what we want it to mean, does what we tell it to, when we tell it to, and always infallibly. Something like the semantic web, perhaps. Matters of ethos surround much more mundane issues as well. Suppose someone interested in libraries and library catalog developments is looking for information on libraries and metadata issues. Among the items available on the web is a blog post by a man or woman named John, J-O-N. John wrote, "I haven't felt the need to set foot in a library except for a meeting in the last 10 years. I haven't used a library OPAC or ILS except for the purpose of researching the system itself in at least a year." For a mathematical theory of communication, this is just another message from just another information source, and like all the rest, it is offered as relevant to all those interested in metadata and library information systems. From a rhetorical perspective, the value of the message is inextricably related to the character, knowledge, experience, beliefs, and values of its source or author. The question thus becomes one of why someone interested in library catalogs would listen to someone who neither uses the library catalog nor even sets foot in the library. And to make myself as clear as possible, let me emphasize that the question becomes one of why I listen to this voice. The answer to that question will differ from one reader to another, and the question, why attend to that particular voice, will remain so long as Google ranks it high enough. Ethical issues arise with metadata only when one considers its creators and users. How should metadata be produced? Some suggest that the human production of metadata item by item is too costly, that given the explosion of information resources, production of metadata by humans is out of the question, that automatic means of generating metadata are good enough for most purposes, therefore we should concentrate, if not wholly, rely on automated methods. Others, noting the evident inadequacy of such methods for many purposes, argue for the retention or even increased use of human production of metadata. Still others admit the value of utilizing both human-created and computationally derived metadata, each for what they alone can provide. The question is then when to provide the one or the other or both, for what materials, for which purposes, and for whom. The debate continues because there is no right answer. The right answer depends on what you want to do, for what purposes, for whom, and so on. A fascinating precursor to this debate over human versus algorithmic decision-making involves no less a figure than Norbert Wiener. Breton mentioned Wiener's views on law and justice in the context of the Internet, writing, "The rejection of the law goes hand in hand with a taste, often immoderate, for the rule, the procedure, the algorithm that adequately describes a problem and permits the self-regulation of its resolution." Norbert Wiener translates into his own terms the sentiment held by many in informatics circles that the law and justice are arbitrary, like subject assignment, given over to questionable judicial procedures and the rhetoric of speech, whereas a good description of the problem in terms of information allows for non-arbitrary and incontestable solutions. In the new cult of the Internet, rule replaces the law, and self-regulation replaces the norm. The ideal resolution of a problem rests in the algorithm. End quote. The production of metadata by algorithms or any other means has even more troubling complications. Communication presupposes that we are doing something for a reason, for this is the sole hope the auditor or information seeker has that the communication has any value. We must assume that the one speaking or writing means something by that activity. If we cannot trust the source of the information, we cannot rely on the information provided. This problem exists not only for human users, but is perhaps much more severe for programmers and the systems they are designing. A few years ago, Brooks argued that, quote, "The web is not a benign socially cooperative environment, but an aggressive competitive arena where authors seek to promote their web content even by abusing topical metadata. As a result, web crawlers must act in self-defense and regard all keywords and topical metadata as spam." End quote. Since web crawlers cannot distinguish between meaningful and meaningless subject metadata, all communication via subject metadata must be treated as meaningless. Related to this is the creation of useless and incorrect metadata by librarians in their cataloging operations, whether this is performed by human action or by automated means. Faced with an information environment in which the meaning of the results cannot be interpreted, the user must act just like the web crawlers and ignore it all. The third matter that I wish to discuss is the nature and role of ontologies in the semantic web as ideas, ideologies, and ongoing projects. An ontology, we read, provides the semantic basis for metadata schemes and facilitates communication among systems and agents by enforcing a standard conceptual model for a community of users. Ontologies, we further read, furnish the vocabulary necessary for communication between social agents and web pages, defining relations between concepts. In practice, an ontology defines terms associated with the text it describes, what they mean themselves, and the formal axioms that restrict the interpretation and use of those terms. Here we see spelled out with as much clarity as naivete the belief that our concepts and language can be furnished, even forced upon us, by the builders of ontologies. One of the great ironies of these ontological efforts is that they are being developed in large part as attempts to overcome the limitations and biases of the linguistic behavior of the users whom they are designed to serve. Ontology theorists suppose that they are dealing with language alone, what terms really mean in themselves. The term ontology itself is taken from philosophy, where the discussion relates to the real world, constants unlike our messy human language. A term in such a philosopher's ontology should thus represent not a possibility, much less a bias, but a name for this or that fact of the real world. Yet in information science, the definitions in an ontology are a guide to proper usage rather than the real world of the philosophers. The natural world is not in question, only natural language. Dahlgren blandly stated, a linguistic-based ontology corresponds to the way people think about objects. It is a useful way to predict their knowledge about thinking about knowledge and structured databases. Presumably, the ontology that is implicit in English does not vary among the speakers of English, the underlying theory of the world revealed in the discourse of English-speaking junkies, computer scientists, televangelists, poets, philosophers, truck drivers, and pop stars, all being identical. Is enforcing a standardized conceptual model for a community of users, as Jacob puts it, something other than enforcing one's own biases and opinions? How reconcile the wisdom of crowds so popular these days with the practice of definitions and standards forced upon all of us by some unknown programmer or group of programmers? Have these writers ignored the lexicographical problem noted by Harris and Hutton that a definition can only be as effective as the context allows it to be, and the context includes the situation of the person seeking to understand the meaning? We read that ontologies codify the knowledge of a domain and are made to be reusable, as though knowledge is static and theoretically defined terms like ontology are never misused to mean their opposites. Do these people believe that the way people think about objects is uniform across time and culture? Do they believe that theory is not hotly debated and changing all the time? The real reason why those designing the semantic web assume knowledge and language to be more serviceable when rendered static is evident in almost every paper on the subject. The world they are designing is a world of machine-machine communication, and the more that people can be made to act like a machine, the better we can interact with that system. I have to stop, I've been told. So, the rest of it is for some other day. Thank you.
Do we have time for questions for our speaker? Yes.
So looking at the two talks that we've had so far, I mean, this is sort of a question for everybody, because I don't think I actually it's a rhetorical question. I don't think we have an answer, but we have seen that the users are infinitely heterogeneous. We have seen that the message, cannot really be defined except in terms of the speaker and the user. So we have this very open thing in which there's really nothing that's sure. And yet at the same time, we just had a study come out from OCLC where the users asked for more evaluative information in the catalog. They want us to tell them what's good. So to me, the ethical question is it ethical to even try?
To try what?
Try to give the users this evaluative information when we can't really know the users and we can't really know the message.
Well, I guess I would disagree. I don't think we're designing information systems for every possible person, for all the world's information. Academic libraries serve academic users, and we assume a certain form of intellectual discourse. I don't catalog philosophy of science for astrologers. I catalog it for philosophers of science and students of philosophy of science who teach and study at the University of Chicago and similar institutions. That doesn't mean that some other person in some other setting will not catalog these books in an entirely different way. I'm just saying that I work for one particular purpose, to communicate with one particular group of readers, and it is the social goals and the socially determined and established setting or context that I work within. So I don't work with the whole universe of information, and I don't work with the whole universe of users. I work with a socially defined group in a socially defined practice.
questions that keeps coming up for me as I look at a whole range of issues with you is that we keep trying to reduce everything down to a single user, as though a particular identity exists for any single person. And my question about communication and strategies around communication are, is it perhaps an opportunity? Is communication not designed to eliminate those very strict definitions of individualism and create collective environments for understanding? And if we look at systems in an attempt to do that, what instead of reducing the system down to what a single individual can use, what changes in our discourse? And I think that you're getting at some of that as well.
Well, I think when you have children and you teach them to speak, you correct their speech. And you correct it according to something that perhaps you learned in school, perhaps something with a form of language which is socially acceptable among your group. And the same thing is true in any institution. You have to learn to communicate in schools in a fashion that is appropriate to the school. In a church, it may be a totally different discourse. In a support group for abused people, you would have a very different kind of language. But you have to learn that. Language is not something innate. Pace Chomsky. You have to learn to fashion your language in concert with those whom you are communicating. My wife is Mongolian, and we talk a kind of a mismatch which is not good Mongolian and it's not good English, but we enjoy it immensely, especially when it means somebody else around us can't understand. But we won't be designing an information system for our conversations. She uses the internet to search Mongolian things and to study English. And one of my major complaints about searching technologies as they are is that they are so monolingual. If you want to search across language, you have to go into every language and search every one. It's one of the reasons I have been a strong advocate of controlled vocabularies and subject assigning, because when I do research on Mongolian, I want to cover Japanese, Chinese, Mongolian, German, Russian, and Polish, as well as French, German, and English. I am not monolingual. And that doesn't mean that every information system has to suit me, but I think every academic system ought to fit my kind of research.
You weren't able to finish your talk, and I'm sorry for that, because my question actually comes at right where you stopped, where you were talking about ontologies, and the idea that you were questioning whether ontology engineers, designers, I like that term, for their particular work, believed that the world was really stable, believed...
Oh, I asked a question.
Yeah, you were asking this question. And I think that's the crux of it. I'm hoping that the paper develops that, or you develop it someplace else, because linked to what I think is belief that purpose drives this contextual understanding and the effectiveness of any system or system that provides input to maintenance to is this idea of belief. Right?
Yeah,
there's a fundamental belief. If you believe,
this is one of the reasons I love Philippe Breton's work, because he is very well grounded in information science. He studied with Jacques Arsac, who was the leader of information science in France, one of the earliest engineers there. He's very philosophically astute. He is very concerned about the passions, the religious notions that have accompanied information science from this little bit in Turing that he starts with. A world that begins in misogyny and misanthropy, really. And how that has influenced the whole field. It may be that Breton is not read in America because we don't like to get that sort of thing.
But what I was trying to say was that, if indeed people really believe that there's a representation of the world, that we are able to represent that, there's an ethical dilemma there.
Well, if you read,
relativism,
if you have followed this,
how we go about designing the system
Wolfram
and talking about them.
Wolfram Alpha has popped out these days recently, and I am just absolutely stunned that someone could talk so glibly about 35 trillion facts as though they have no theoretical context. That you know,
we have to
and
be a bit reflexive about this then too, because if we think as relativists that we're right, we place ourselves on a morally high.
well, I'm not talking about. I'm not talking about relativism. I'm not talking about relativism. I'm just saying that if you are walking down the street and you believe the world is flat, it doesn't matter. If you are trying to build a rocket to go to the moon and you believe that the world is flat, it does matter. So I'm not talking about truth in some God's eye sense. But we live our lives without knowing anything, most of it. But what we need to do, we have to know something which is adequate to what we want to do. If you want to ride a bicycle, you don't have to know physics, but you have to know how to hold your balance. And what goes up must come down unless you can hold your balance.
But again there, I just want to sensitize this because you switched from belief to knowledge there. And I'm not so sure that engineering and the ontology landscape, it's going to be such a quick switch from belief to knowledge there. I mean, we're in a plurality of discussing knowledge organization structures. A lot of people talking about a lot of philosophical points of view. And it was just...
Well, I'm
in the paper that you put yourself in a particular position against ontology engineers.
I'm not saying against. I'm quoting particular engineers, and I'm actually astounded at their. Now, one of the places I was going where I stopped was the discussion of Berners-Lee. He says a program that wants to compare or combine information across the two databases has to know that these two terms are being used to mean the same thing. Ideally, the program must have a way to discover such common meanings for blah, blah, blah. So we have programs now that want, compare, know, discover. Are we talking metaphors? Or is this anthropomorphization? Does he really believe that programs do these things in the same way that human beings do them? And that if human beings, or if programs have imitated these things, do they really think they understand what humans do? I think there's Berners-Lee is no philosopher. These are unproblematic statements for him, whereas to me,
I would suggest the two of you sit together for lunch.